let's talk a little bit about the history of the idea of evolution. Where did this idea even come from? We're looking at an image from the University of California Museum of Paleontology. What we see here when we look at the image is time on the y-axis, starting at the 1800s, before the 1800s at the bottom, and from 1900 to the present at the top. And then we have 4 columns where a number of concepts are distributed. And we're going to be talking about concepts that are in the Earth's history column and the life's history column. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we're going to be talking about 5 of them here right now. The first thing we're going to talk about is fossils. Okay, but before we dive into that, consider where people got their ideas in the universities of Europe. And why do we focus on these universities? Our university is a descendant of these universities. Our concept of science emerged from these universities, so they're ancestral to us, and let's focus on them. Their ideas about the natural world were written down in what we consider to be religious texts and classics. For example, Aristotle, Plato, the Bible. Okay, we're looking at here, by the way, this is a picture from Raphael here on the right, where Plato and Aristotle debating in Athens. And then on the left there we're looking at a beautiful image from the book of Genesis. That's in Latin, of course. Alright, so this is where our ideas come from. As explorers left Europe in the Age of Exploration, they began to encounter all kinds of new things that hadn't previously been considered, and that began to change the way they thought about the things that they knew. So what we're looking at in this picture, for example, is fossils that are discovered by soldiers in the army of Napoleon. Here they're working in the Dolomites, and what they observe here, as we can see, are fossils of seashells that are at the top of the Italian Alps. Well, what are they doing there? How did they get there? They're hundreds of miles from the ocean, and yet there are these rocks that clearly look like seashells. So fossils are one of the things that begin to disrupt the ideas of how the natural world worked. Here we are looking again in the 19th century. This is a fossil excavation, a drawing of a fossil excavation in the British Empire. And note there on the right, the size of the bone that has been excavated and the skull that's being pulled out. What's so remarkable is there's no organisms on Earth that look like that now that are alive. And how could that be? That was the kind of challenge that confronted these explorers in those times. So eventually these ideas got synthesized into the concept that right on our planet that we thought we knew so well, there existed animals and plants that we can only imagine what they were like today. Let's move on to another concept. Uniformitarianism. There is a college word for you. Let's talk about what that is and why we care. It starts out in geology. During this period of time that we're discussing, the 18th century and the 19th century, there's lots of new ideas that develop in geology. Okay. Let's talk about the principle of uniformity, also called uniformitarianism. This is the idea that rates of geological processes that happened in the past are the same as those rates that take place in the present. So in other words, we could measure the rate of sediment buildup from erosion in a river today and predict what that means about the rates in the past. So who cares? This is a way to infer the age of geological features on our planet. So for example, if we look at the Grand Canyon, as we will in the next slide, we can say, gee, it sure is deep. If it eroded at 1 millimeter a year, it's got to be really old. So the principle of uniformity and uniformitarianism helped thinkers in the era of Darwin realize that the Earth was old. Why do we care in evolutionary biology? We care because this is important for there to be enough time for one species to evolve from another. We're looking at a couple of pictures of the Grand Canyon here, and you can see all of the strata or layers of sediment in these rocks. And these are maybe 5,000 feet of exposed rock, and you can clearly understand by seeing this how it became clear to scientists of Charles Lyell and era how old the Earth really was. Similarly, when we look at the right and we see how much time would have had to pass for such a canyon to be carved at a millimeter at a time per year through to such great depths. Let's look at another concept that impacted evolution that emerged from geology. That is biostratigraphy. This is a field that integrates both geology and fossils, or the life sciences. Charles Lyell and other geologists of his era realized that there were different types of fossils that would be found at different depths or different positions within strata of sedimentary rock. In this picture, we're looking at sketches from Charles Lyell's book showing strata of rock down at the bottom, and at the top we're showing drawings that he made of different types of organisms, both plant and animals, that he found fossilized in these rocks. Scientists of Charles Lyell's era realized they could integrate information from geology and information about fossils to learn something about the history of life on Earth. Their ideas were based on the following. Deeper layers or strata of rock in a series of sedimentary rock layers were formed in earlier times in the past. Those layers of rock that are closest to the surface were formed more recently. Therefore, fossils that are found deeper in layers of sedimentary rock had to have lived in more ancient times. Those found in more shallow layers of rock lived more recently. And that tells us something about the patterns of life and perhaps evolution. If we look, for example, up here, we see fossils of mammals, and they are only found in more shallow layers of rock. That tells us that they had to form more recently than some of the organisms that live deeper down. So this concept that we're talking about here is the kind of information that could be drawn from biostratigraphy. We are looking here at a graph that shows us time on the x-axis, it's geological time, and on the y-axis we're looking at the number of families of organisms that are present in rock, in fossils that are in rocks from these different eras of geological time. When I say families, I mean in the phylogenetic sense, such as species, genus, order, families. Okay. So what we see here that's remarkable is the increase in the number of families that are present in the fossil record as we go forward in geological time from the past to the present. An increase in diversity of the types of organisms that are present. The numbers on the slide here, etc., and the corresponding arrows point to important times when new organisms organisms appear in the fossil record. So for example, at number 7, we see the point in the past when land animals appear. And when we look at number 9, we see the point in time when the first flying organisms appear. What's interesting from the point of view of the development of the concept of evolution is that scientists, of course, first approached all this information thinking all the species were formed or created at once on Earth. And if that's the case, why is there this progression in the fossil record? Why is it that not all the organisms are found in all the different layers of rock, since they would have all been there at the same time? The observations that they made from looking at many different strata of rock and looking at the patterns are more consistent with the idea that species evolve. Let's look at another concept that contributed to the development of ideas in evolution. That is comparative anatomy. This was a field started relatively early in the biological sciences. This was pioneered by Georges Cuvier in France. He's one of the fathers, if you will, of modern biology. In the era of Georges Cuvier and Charles Darwin, scientists, or natural philosophers as they were referred to at that time, did lots of dissections of all kinds of animals to learn about their anatomy and physiology. And one of the discoveries that was made was that many diverse organisms, many diverse vertebrates, shared a similar bone structure. For example, here we're looking at pictures of tetrapod forelimbs. So you'll see, for example, in the top row on this slide, we're looking at frog, lizard, and bird, and each of them has a humerus, an ulna, a radius, and then digits or carpal bones extending there at the end. At the bottom we see ourselves, the humans, cat, whale, bat, and all of these organisms share a similar bone structure. Yet, of course, we're very different phenotypically in our appearances, in our traits, when we look at ourselves from the outside. For example, bats have wings, as well as birds. Whales have fins, and they swim. Lizards are yet a different group. Frogs are amphibians, and yet we share this common structure. The question that emerged among these natural philosophers was, why is it that there's a common structure among all these different types of organisms? If they were all created de novo, that means from scratch, all at the same time, why couldn't their structures all be different? But yet they're not. A simple explanation for this is perhaps they all descended from a common ancestor who shared this general structure. And in that way, this type of data from comparative anatomy contributed to the idea that existing organisms had a common ancestor. Another feature of comparative anatomy that contributed to concepts in evolution was the identification of what we call vestigial organs, or anatomical parts that have no known function. So we know some of these in our own body. We think of the appendix, for example, in our gut. Here's one that I really like. This is a sketch of a whale, and when we look at the skeleton of a whale, we see that it has a pelvis. And what's fascinating is, why would a whale have a pelvis when the function of a pelvis is to hold an upper body, i.e. your trunk, on top of legs and allow the legs can move? You don't need a pelvis if you're like a whale and you don't have legs. So the question that came up then was, well, why is it that some of these animals that we observe have leftover parts in them? I mean, was the creator just not paying attention? That makes no sense at all. Our concept in evolution is that these parts used to have a function for an ancestor of the organisms that we're inspecting, and they are vestigial in the sense that as these organisms have evolved over time, these features of their anatomy no longer have a function and still remain. Perhaps if we were to look at the descendants of these organisms many years in the future, they would no longer have this part as well. Natural philosophers thinking about the concept of evolution realized that if one species was giving rise to new species over many generations, that perhaps as forms changed or gave rise to new forms, that we might find in the fossil record transitional species. That is, something in between one major change to the next. A classic example of this would be the transition from aquatic organisms, vertebrates such as fish living in the oceans, to the land vertebrates that need lungs. If we're going to have organisms that live on land, they will need lungs. And where would these come from? Could they come suddenly, or rather, perhaps there would be some sort of intermediate organism that was a fish that might have also had lungs? And indeed, what became observed was that there was evidence of so-called lungfish in the fossil record, and then later there were living examples of lungfish that came to be known, and these ideas supported this concept that are indeed transitional forms, that it's not an unreasonable concept to think that transition from one type of organism to the next could occur. Another classic example of a transitional species fossil is that of Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx was a flying reptile, and this fossil supported the concept that modern birds, are the descendants of reptiles, and supported this idea that transitional species are a plausible concept in the history of evolution. Let's move to our last concept before we wrap up this section of our class. The last one I want to talk about here is a concept called biogeography. When we talk about biogeography, we're considering species distribution and its contribution to ideas in evolutionary biology. And this whole approach to understanding something about evolution was first introduced by Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, and really a brilliant man. He's the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution along with Charles Darwin. Wallace was an animal and plant collector, and he was working in Indonesia and Southeast Asia during the 19th century. And he realized, as he was collecting animals and plants in this area, that marsupials were only found in an area, parts of Indonesia that were contiguous, that were near Australia. And conversely, mammals were only found in parts of Indonesia that were closer to Asia. There you can see in this map, we see China and Thailand, etc., and up there further to the north. And it made him wonder, why is this? Because what's so particularly interesting about this, I'm going to turn on our laser pointer here, is right in this area where the marsupials and the mammals meet, right where this red line is here that we now call the Wallace line, right in this area, the ecology of the area is very similar. The habitats are similar. There's the same amount of heat on one side of the line as the other. There's the same amount of rainfall, the same types of jungles. So there's no reason why the mammals should only be on one side and the marsupials on the other based on the conditions. They could live on either side of the line and do well. That thought led Wallace to say, gee, maybe it's because marsupials originated in Australia and evolved there and began to distribute themselves north from Australia, and conversely, mammals started out in Asia, and as they migrated and southward and began to evolve, forming new species that way, they eventually, coming from the north, reached this point, i.e. what we call the Wallace line, where they encountered the marsupials. That explanation is more rational than the alternative of saying, gee, if we had a creator who placed all these organisms at the same time right when the earth was created, why did he bother putting some of them into all of these kind of the north and all through the south when they all do fine? He could put them wherever they wanted. Why didn't they end up distributed like that? Well, that kind of logic doesn't exclude the possibility that it could have happened. There's no reason a creator had to be logical. But if we're trying to be scientific about this, just focused on data, not invoking supernatural concepts of how things were introduced and set up, Wallace's idea is consistent with hypotheses about evolution as a model.